Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next move. Stop! They thought Eleanor Vance was home crying. She was actually buying a $10,000 dress and hiring the best private detective in the city. Tell us in the comments, do you believe a person can be completely betrayed and still achieve victory? What would you do in a situation like this? Part 1. The coronation of audacity. The young woman in Scarlett Valentino, clinging to Alexander Sterling's arm at the Grand Astor Club in New York, knew 3 crucial things. First, that Eleanor Vance had orchestrated every detail for her to be there that night. Second, that the flash drive in Eleanor's Hermes bag contained photos of Scarlett with 2 other married men over the last 6 months. And third, most importantly, that in 30 minutes, Scarlett Blake would leave that gala ball weeping like a child, while Eleanor would become the legend that New York high society would recount for the next 50 years. Alexander thought he was trading a boring wife for a luxury arm candy. Scarlett thought she was conquering a prince. Neither of them imagined they had just awakened a queen. And queens do not forgive. They destroy with style. The September night at the Grand Astor Club was drenched in ostentation and falsehood. Baccarat crystal chandeliers cast a golden light over the main ballroom, where the crème de la crème of New York society gathered for the Legacy Foundation's traditional annual gala ball. Alexander Sterling adjusted the cuff of his Italian silk shirt for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. At 38, the real estate mogul had built an empire that guaranteed him a constant presence in the social columns. But tonight, specifically, he felt particularly anxious, not because of the event's importance, but because of the company he had chosen to bring. Scarlett Blake glided through the ballroom as if she owned the place. At 29, the young woman flaunted a striking, artificially enhanced beauty, with platinum blonde hair falling in perfect waves over bare shoulders, highlighted by the Scarlett Valentino gown Alexander had specially purchased for the occasion. The generous cleavage and the fabric that hugged every curve of her body did not go unnoticed by the male gazes present, nor by the whispered comments of the society matrons. "Alexander, darling," the sharp voice of Mrs. Victoria Albright, a senator's wife, cut the air like a knife. "What a surprise to see you here, and with company." Her eyes scanned Scarlett from head to toe, a predatory analysis disguised as social courtesy. "Victoria, always a pleasure." Alexander forced a smile, while feeling sweat form in small beads on his forehead. "This is Scarlett Blake, my special consultant." Scarlett laughed, a crystalline sound that resonated in the room. "Consultant? What modesty, my love." Her blood-red nails possessively caressed Alexander's arm. "We're much more intimate than that, aren't we?" Alexander's embarrassment was palpable, but Scarlett seemed to feed on the situation. She had spent months planning this moment, the night she would finally be introduced in society as Alexander Sterling's new woman. In her young, ambitious mind, this was her official coronation. The legitimate wife, Eleanor, had become a ghostly figure in their conversations, a woman who preferred discretion to the spotlight. And this, for Scarlett, was a sign of weakness. "And where is Mrs. Sterling?" Victoria's question was posed with the surgical precision of someone who knows exactly where to poke to inflict pain. "I haven't seen her at a social event in ages." Alexander swallowed. "Eleanor has been busy with personal projects." "What a shame," Victoria murmured, though her tone suggested the opposite. She was such an elegant woman. She always knew how to behave with class. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Scarlett felt a pang of irritation. Why did everyone keep comparing her to that faded woman? "Alexander, I need to talk to you about the marina project," interrupted David Shaw, one of the firm's junior partners. The relief on Alexander's face was instantaneous. While the men stepped away to discuss business, Scarlett remained alone in the center of the ballroom, feeling like a queen on her throne. Social photographers' flashes found her constantly, and she knew her photos would be featured in the gossip magazines the following week. Alexander Sterling's new passion. Oh, she could already imagine the headlines. Bubbly champagne flowed generously among the guests, and Scarlett didn't hold back. With every sip, she felt more secure, more in control. She approached a group of socialites she knew superficially from salons and gyms in the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. "Scarlett, what a stunning dress," commented Patricia, the wife of a judge. "Valentino, a gift from Alexander," Scarlett replied, making sure to emphasize the intimacy. "He has such refined taste for choosing women's clothing." The women exchanged knowing glances. They all knew what that meant. Alexander Sterling was publicly flaunting his mistress, a behavior that, while not uncommon in these circles, still caused a stir when done so blatantly. "And how are you adapting to your new position?" Patricia's question was loaded, and they all laughed discreetly. "Perfectly," Scarlett retorted, lifting her chin. "In fact, I've always felt more at home in this environment than certain people who isolate themselves at home." The malicious comment about Eleanor did not go unnoticed. The women present knew the unwritten code of high society well. When a wife stopped appearing at events, it usually meant she had lost the battle to a younger, more ambitious rival. On the other side of the room, Alexander tried to focus on the business conversation, but his eyes constantly drifted towards Scarlett. Part of him felt proud to be with a woman so young and attractive. It was a confirmation of his virility and success. Another part, however, began to question the wisdom of so openly exposing his extramarital relationship. "She's gorgeous," commented David, following Alexander's gaze. "But don't you think it's risky to bring your friend to an event of this magnitude?" "Scarlett isn't just a friend," Alexander retorted, more defensively than he intended. "We have a serious relationship." "Serious?" David raised an eyebrow. "And does your wife know?" Alexander looked away. Eleanor knew, of course. How could she not know? The rumors had been rampant for months, and he hadn't even bothered to be discreet. But Eleanor, true to her reserved nature, hadn't made scenes or threats. She had simply withdrawn further, which Alexander had interpreted as tacit acceptance of the new situation. "Eleanor understands that our marriage has evolved into something different," he murmured, sipping Scotch whiskey. The truth was, Alexander had married Eleanor Vance 15 years ago for practical reasons. She came from a traditional family with important connections in the judiciary and politics, connections that were crucial to his business growth. Eleanor was intelligent, cultured, a perfect wife on paper. But as the years passed, Alexander began to see her as part of the furniture, always present, always reliable. But without the sparkle and excitement he had started seeking elsewhere. Scarlett represented everything his wife was not: spontaneous, sensual, impressionable. "Alexander!" Scarlett's voice snapped him back to the present. She approached with a radiant smile, followed by a younger man he recognized as Ethan Campbell, the heir to one of the country's largest fortunes. "Ethan was just telling me about the new art collection he recently acquired," Scarlett said, her eyes gleaming with interest. "Picasso, Van Gogh! It's fascinating!" Alexander felt a pang of irritation. Scarlett was clearly flirting. And Ethan, known for his womanizing reputation, seemed willing to reciprocate. It was humiliating to have to compete for his own mistress's attention in public. "Scarlett, we need to speak with the event organizers," he interrupted, taking her arm. "But Alexander, Ethan was inviting me to see his private gallery," she pouted. "Another time," Alexander retorted dryly, guiding her away from the young heir. As they walked across the ballroom, Scarlett whispered in his ear, "You don't have to be jealous, my love. You know you're the only man in my life." The words were supposed to reassure him, But Alexander felt a growing unease. There was something about Scarlett's attitude tonight, an excessive confidence, an assumption that her place was guaranteed, that deeply bothered him. Near the main table, where event organizers and important politicians were seated, Alexander saw Dr. Julian Hale, an influential society columnist. The man was observing them with evident interest, already mentally drafting the note that would appear in his column the next day. Alexander Sterling, it's been a while. Julian approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And this lovely young woman must be Mrs. Sterling? The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander felt his face flush as Scarlett, far from being embarrassed, smiled even wider. Not yet, she retorted with a giggle. But who knows, maybe soon. The insinuation was crystal clear. Scarlett was not content with just being the mistress. She had bigger plans, and she was announcing them to one of the city's most dangerous gossips. Alexander forced a nervous laugh. Julian, meet Scarlett Blake. Scarlett is one of the city's most respected journalists. It's a great pleasure, Julian said, kissing Scarlett's hand with exaggerated gallantry. I imagine we'll have much to talk about in the near future. The veiled threat did not go unnoticed by Alexander. Julian Hale had the power to make or break reputations with a single column. If he decided to turn the situation into a scandal, the consequences could be devastating, not only for his public image, but for his business. While they spoke, the ballroom continued to fill. Influential politicians greeted businessmen. Socialites flaunted their latest acquisitions of jewelry and couture, and the orchestra played classic waltzes, creating a perfect soundtrack for this theater of appearances. Scarlett was in her element. She greeted acquaintances, posed for photos, waved to important people as if she were, in fact, Mrs. Sterling. Every gesture was calculated to solidify her position, to make it clear that she was not just a passing fling, but the new reality in Alexander's life. But deep in her ambitious mind, Scarlett could not entirely ignore the whispers she heard passing by. Where is Eleanor Vance? What a shame. Poor Eleanor was always such a distinguished lady. Why did everyone insist on talking about that woman? Scarlett had never met her personally. Alexander always said that Eleanor preferred to avoid conflicts and confrontations. To her, this only confirmed her superiority. While Eleanor hit it home, she shone in the halls of high society. What Scarlett did not know was that at that very moment, just a few blocks away, Eleanor Vance was meticulously preparing for her own entry into the Grand Astor Club. And when she arrived, nothing would ever be the same. If you were Alexander, what would you do? Do you believe revenge can be an act of elegance? Leave your opinion in the comments. Part 2. The Strategy in Black Chanel. Eleanor Vance stood before the full-length mirror in her dressing room, observing her own image with the analytical coolness of a general planning a battle. At 38, she possessed a mature, sophisticated beauty that contrasted drastically with the obvious, youthful allure of her rival. Her dark brown hair fell in soft waves to her shoulders, framing a face with classic features that needed no heavy makeup to make an impact. The dress she had chosen for the night was a masterpiece of French haute couture, a black Chanel couture with an impeccable cut, featuring pearl details that ran across the discreet yet elegant neckline. The piece had cost more than many cars, but it wasn't the price that made it special. It was what it represented. Power, class, legitimacy. Everything Scarlett Blake was trying to purchase with borrowed money from another woman's husband. Eleanor knew exactly what was happening at the Grand Astor Club at that moment. She had received no less than 15 calls from concerned friends throughout the week, each eager to be the first to tell her about the public humiliation Alexander was inflicting. What none of them knew was that Eleanor had orchestrated every detail of that situation. "Ma'am, "The car has arrived," announced Maria, her housekeeper for over a decade. The middle-aged woman looked at Eleanor with equal parts admiration and concern. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile she had worn in months. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life, Maria." The truth was that Eleanor had discovered Alexander's betrayal long before any social gossip. Not because she was particularly astute, but because Alexander was shamefully careless. Receipts for expensive restaurants for two when he was supposedly at work meetings, charges for jewelry and dresses on his corporate card, a woman's perfume on his clothes that was definitely not hers. During the first few months, Eleanor felt the familiar pain of betrayal, the wound to her ego, the feeling of inadequacy, the questioning of where she had failed as a wife. But then, on a particularly melancholy Tuesday afternoon, something shifted. She was looking through a wedding photo album when she came across an image of herself on her wedding day. In that photo, she radiated a light that had been lost during the years of marriage. It was at that moment that Eleanor grasped a liberating truth. She hadn't lost Alexander because she failed as a wife. She had lost Alexander because he failed as a man. Based on this epiphany, Eleanor began to plan. Not a vulgar, emotional revenge, but a cold, surgical strategy that would not only expose the couple's farce, but also guarantee her the freedom she had subconsciously desired for years. For the next 6 months, Eleanor watched. She discreetly hired a private investigator, not to confirm the betrayal she already knew, but to meticulously document it. Photographs, videos, hotel records, even recordings of compromising conversations Alexander and Scarlett had in public places, thinking they were safe in the bubble of arrogance they had created. More importantly, Eleanor used this time to reorganize her finances. Alexander always assumed she was financially dependent on him, an ignorant, sexist assumption. In reality, Eleanor had inherited a considerable fortune from her paternal grandmother, real estate investments and stocks that she managed personally without involving her husband. Furthermore, she had her own successful art consulting business. During the months of her absence from social events, Eleanor had also dedicated herself to herself in a way she hadn't in years. A personal trainer 3 times a week, regular beauty treatments, a complete wardrobe overhaul. Not to win Alexander back. That bridge was irreversibly burned. But for herself. Tonight, specifically, Eleanor had chosen the Legacy Foundation Gala for precise strategic reasons. It was an event that brought together the core of the New York elite, people who had known her family for decades and who respected her lineage and class. It was also an environment where unwritten social rules played in her favor. As much as they tolerated male excesses in private, the public exposure of a marital betrayal was still considered an act of bad taste that deserved to be punished. Most crucially, Eleanor knew Alexander would bring Scarlett to the ball. It was she herself who, through a mutual friend, had planted the idea in the ambitious young mistress's head. The Legacy Foundation Gala is the most important event of the year, she had strategically commented during a luncheon. That's where society truly presents itself. Eleanor's private chauffeur, John, was waiting for her at the building entrance. "Good evening, Mrs. Vance," he greeted, opening the door of the black Mercedes-Benz S-Class. "You look dazzling tonight." "Thank you, John." To the Grand Astor Club. During the 30-minute drive, Eleanor mentally reviewed every detail of her plan. She had scheduled her arrival for the exact moment the ball was at its peak, when all the important guests were present, when the social photographers were most active, when Alexander and Scarlett were most relaxed and confident. Eleanor's phone vibrated with a message from Leonore, the wife of a judge and one of her oldest friends. "Darling, they are shamelessly exhibiting themselves. She is practically announcing herself as your replacement. Come fast and end this farce. Eleanor smiled, reading the message. Leonore had always been her fiercest ally, a woman of the old guard who wholeheartedly believed that certain social traditions and hierarchies should be respected. To Leonore, Scarlet was nothing more than a classless social climber, trying to occupy a place that didn't belong to her. Other messages followed, all from indignant friends, reporting on Alexander and Scarlet's behavior. "She's wearing a red Valentino, completely inappropriate for a charity event," wrote Patricia. He introduced her as a special consultant, but she herself corrected him, saying they were much more intimate, added Victoria Albright. Every message confirmed that Eleanor's plan was working perfectly. Alexander and Scarlet were digging their own grave with an almost comical enthusiasm. "We are arriving, Mrs. Vance," John announced, interrupting her reflections. Eleanor looked out the window and saw the golden lights of the Grand Astor Club shining in the night. Dozens of luxury cars were parked at the entrance, while paparazzi and social photographers awaited the arrival of important figures. The red carpet stretched from the sidewalk to the main door, flanked by lush floral arrangements. "John, give me 5 more minutes," Eleanor requested. "I want my entrance to be memorable." She opened her Hermes bag and checked the contents one last time. In addition to the usual items, there was a discreet flash drive containing all the documents and evidence she had compiled on Alexander and Scarlet. She didn't plan to use it tonight, but it was always good to have an ace up her sleeve. Eleanor also carried something far more powerful than any physical evidence: the absolute certainty that she was doing the right thing. For 15 years, she had been the discreet, perfect wife who solved problems without making waves. Tonight, she would be the opposite. "Now, John, it's showtime." The driver smiled through the rearview mirror. He had watched Eleanor grow from a shy young woman to a powerful one, and he knew this night would be historic. When the Mercedes stopped in front of the Grand Astor Club, a murmur spread among the photographers. Eleanor Vance had become a mysterious figure in recent months. Her absence from social events had generated speculation and conspiracy theories. Now, her reappearance promised answers. John got out of the car and walked calmly to the rear door. The silence was almost palpable. Even the most seasoned paparazzi knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. When the door opened and Eleanor stepped onto the red carpet, there was a moment of suspended time. She was radiant in a way no one remembered seeing her before. More confident, more commanding, more genuinely powerful. Flashes erupted in a frantic sequence as Eleanor walked slowly toward the entrance. Every step was calculated. Every movement was a declaration. She acknowledged the crowd with elegant waves, but did not stop for interviews. There was more important work to be done. At the club entrance, the doorman greeted her with an almost feudal bow. "Mrs. Vance, what an honor to have you back with us." "The pleasure is mine, Robert. A beautiful night, isn't it?" As she walked through the club's corridors toward the main ballroom, Eleanor could hear the crowd's murmur inside. Music, laughter, animated conversations. The sound of people who had no idea their lives were about to be turned upside down. She paused in front of the ballroom's double doors. She adjusted her pearl necklace one last time and took a deep breath. On the other side of those doors were Alexander and Scarlet, likely still basking in the attention they received, still believing they had conquered something important. They had no idea that the true queen had arrived to claim her throne. Part 3. The elite duel. The ballroom of the Grand Astor Club was at its peak when Eleanor Vance made her entrance. The orchestra played a Strauss waltz. Couples danced elegantly in the center of the hall, and the hum of conversations created a symphony of polite courtesy. Alexander was near the bar, laughing heartily at a joke David Shaw had just told him, when the first whisper reached his ears. "Eleanor has arrived." The smile froze on his face. He slowly turned, searching for the familiar figure of his wife, but couldn't find her in the crowd. Part of his brain still expected it to be a rumor. "Alexander!" Leonore's voice sounded behind him like the harbinger of a storm. "Your wife looks stunning tonight." He turned and saw Leonore, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The kind of smile that high society women used when they were about to witness the public humiliation of someone they deemed deserving. It was then he saw her. Eleanor was entering the main hall with the serenity of a queen returning to her palace after a long exile. There was something different about her, an aura of power and self-possession that Alexander did not recall ever seeing before. The black Chanel gown hugged her silhouette with mathematical elegance. The pearls on her neck caught the light hypnotically, and her brown hair gleamed like polished silk. But the most impressive thing was her posture. Eleanor did not walk. She glided. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture calculated for maximum impact. And wherever she passed, conversation ceased, gazes turned, and a respectful silence spread like ripples in a pond. Alexander felt his mouth go dry. In 15 years of marriage, he had never seen Eleanor dominate a room that way. It was as if she had gone from being a supporting character to the protagonist of her own life. On the other side of the room, Scarlett was recounting an anecdote to a group of businessmen's wives when she noticed her audience had become distracted. They were all looking at something, or someone, behind her. "What is it?" she asked, turning to follow the direction of their gazes. And then she saw her too. Scarlett had often fantasized about what her first encounter with Alexander's legitimate wife would be like. In her fantasies, Eleanor would be a faded woman, visibly aged, clearly inferior in every way that mattered. The reality was a brutal shock. The woman walking toward her radiated a natural elegance that no amount of money could buy. There was something almost aristocratic in her posture, an innate class that suddenly made Scarlett feel like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. Eleanor greeted the guests with the perfect grace of someone born into that world. A kiss on Victoria Albright's cheek, a warm handshake with the senator, a kind word for the judge's wife. Every interaction reaffirmed her position in the social hierarchy, not as the betrayed wife seeking sympathy, but as the grand dame returning to her rightful place. "Eleanor, darling!" Patricia's voice rang out like a crystal bell. The judge's wife approached with open arms, clearly moved to see her friend after months of absence. "What immense joy to have you back. We missed you terribly." "Patricia, you're radiant as always," Eleanor replied, her voice melodious with a tone of genuine affection. "How are you, Robert? I heard the Supreme Court appointment was confirmed." Yes, we are very happy. But tell us about you. Where have you been hiding all these months? You were missed so much." Eleanor smiled with mysterious elegance. "I was taking care of some personal affairs. Sometimes a woman needs time to reorganize her priorities." The response was diplomatically vague, but charged with a subtext that did not go unnoticed by the women present. They all knew about the situation with Alexander and Scarlett, and now they began to understand that Eleanor's absence from social events had not been due to humiliation or despair, but to strategy. While Eleanor spoke, Alexander remained paralyzed near the bar. Part of him wanted to approach, greet her as if nothing had changed, maintain the facade of a harmonious marriage they had always presented in public. The other part, the cowardly, guilty part, just wanted to disappear. The decision was taken by Scarlett. The young woman, fueled by a toxic mix of jealousy and youthful arrogance, decided she would not be eclipsed by an older woman, no matter how elegant. After all, she was the one with Alexander now. She was the one wearing the expensive gifts, the one occupying his bed, the one with future plans with him. "Alexander," she whispered, pulling on his arm. "Let's go greet your wife. It's the polite thing to do." Alexander swallowed. "Scarlet, maybe it's not the best time." "Nonsense," she retorted, already walking toward the group surrounding Eleanor. Scarlet did not realize she was about to commit the most catastrophic mistake of her young life. In her limited mind, this would be the moment of her official coronation, when she would present herself as Alexander's new woman to the former wife. Definitively establishing the new hierarchical order, Eleanor saw the couple approach long before they reached her. Her eyes met Alexander's for a brief moment, and he visibly flinched under her gaze. It was as if she could see right through him, seeing all the guilt, all the shame, all the cowardice he carried. "Eleanor!" Alexander forced a smile as he approached the group. His voice came out higher than he intended. "What a surprise to see you here." The silence that followed was deafening. All nearby conversations ceased. All eyes turned toward the trio, and even the orchestra seemed to lower its volume. It was as if the entire ballroom was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Eleanor looked at Alexander for a long moment, her expression perfectly serene. When she finally spoke, her voice had the cutting coldness of tempered steel. "Alexander, what an interesting coincidence. I thought you were in Chicago this week. An important meeting with investors. Isn't that what you said?" The lie was exposed with surgical elegance. Alexander had fabricated that excuse to justify his absence from home in recent days, when in fact, he was at a luxury hotel with Scarlet, preparing for the ball. Now, confronted with his own dishonesty in public, he stammered, The meeting was cancelled, last minute." "What a shame," Eleanor murmured, her tone suggesting the opposite. "Well, at least you didn't miss an event as important as this." It was then that Scarlet decided to intervene. The young woman, misinterpreting the moment and thinking Eleanor was being submissive by not directly confronting the situation, took a step forward with a smile that was meant to be understanding, but sounded condescending. "You must be Eleanor," she said, extending a hand with perfectly manicured red nails. "I'm Scarlet Blake. I've heard so much about you." The group around them collectively held their breath. It was a moment of tension so palpable that even guests further away began to approach discreetly, sensing something extraordinary was about to happen. Eleanor looked at Scarlet's extended hand for a moment that seemed eternal. Then, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, she delicately shook it. "Scarlet, yes, I've heard a lot about you too." The phrase was delivered with such elegance that it took Scarlet a few seconds to realize the venom it contained. "Alexander told me you worked together," Eleanor continued, her voice maintaining the perfectly polite tone of high society. "Something about project development consulting?" Alexander opened his mouth to reply, but Scarlet interrupted him, clearly eager to establish her true position. "Oh, we are much more than colleagues," she giggled, a high-pitched sound that resonated uncomfortably in the ballroom's silence. "In fact, Alexander and I have a very special relationship." The words left her mouth with the confidence of someone who thought she was revealing a truth that would give her power over the situation. Instead, she had just fallen into the most elegant trap ever constructed at a New York social event. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if processing particularly interesting information. "Ah, I see," she said, her voice still maintaining that deadly courtesy. "How brave of you to make it public like this." The word brave was delivered in such a way that it sounded exactly like its antonym. Scarlet began to realize something was wrong, but her youth and inexperience prevented her from fully decoding the nuances of the conversation. Alexander, on the other hand, was pale as a sheet. He knew Eleanor well enough to recognize the danger signs, the overly polite tone, the smile that didn't reach her eyes, the upright, controlled posture. She was furious, but expressing that fury through the refined codes of high society, which made her infinitely more dangerous than any emotional outburst. "Eleanor," he tried to intervene again, Perhaps we should— Oh, Alexander, she interrupted gently. There's no need for embarrassment among civilized people. She turned back to Scarlett with renewed interest. Tell me, darling, how long have you two been working together? Scarlett, interpreting the question as an opportunity to establish her supremacy, replied with youthful pride. About 8 months. Alexander has been a wonderful mentor. Mentor, Eleanor repeated, as if savoring the word. What an interesting term to describe the relationship. The air in the ballroom was so charged with tension that even the waiters stopped circulating with champagne trays. Dozens of eyes were fixed on the trio, and Julian Hale, the society columnist, was observing everything from a strategic distance, clearly taking mental notes for his column the next day. Leonore Albright approached the group with a smile that promised trouble. Eleanor, darling, what a stunning dress. Chanel, isn't it? I've always envied your impeccable taste in fashion. Thank you, Leonore. You know how it is. Some pieces never go out of style, do they? The implication was clear. True elegance is timeless, unlike the passing trends certain younger people exhibit. Scarlett, finally starting to realize she was being subtly attacked, decided to counterattack. Your dress is beautiful too, she told Eleanor, her tone trying to sound generous but failing miserably. Very classic. It must have been terribly expensive. The comment was a grotesque blunder, suggesting that Eleanor cared about the price of her clothes, or worse, that she needed to justify her spending, was a display of poor class that made several women present gasp in shock. Eleanor smiled. This time, a truly dangerous smile. My dear, she said, her voice soft as velvet, but sharp as a razor. When you have true class, the price becomes irrelevant. It is something you are either born with or you never acquire. The phrase fell upon Scarlett like a silent bomb. For a moment, the young woman was speechless, slowly processing the fact that she had been publicly outclassed in the most elegant way possible. Alexander tried to intervene again, his voice desperate. Well, I think we should all— Alexander, Eleanor interrupted him again, this time turning her full attention to him. Since we are all gathered here, so, casually, perhaps it's a good time to clarify a few things. The entire ballroom seemed to have paused. Not even the sound of the orchestra could be heard, as if the musicians also wanted to hear what would happen next. Clarifications are always welcome, murmured Leonore Albright, barely containing her excitement. Eleanor adjusted the pearls at her neck with deliberately slow movements, like a matador preparing the final thrust. You see, her voice now taking on a tone of genuine amusement, there are certain illusions that must be dispelled before they cause more embarrassment than they already have. Scarlett felt a chill of panic run down her spine. There was something about Eleanor's demeanor, an absolute confidence, an almost predatory serenity, that suggested she knew something monumental, something that would completely change the game. I don't understand, Scarlett gasped. Oh, darling, Eleanor retorted, her smile now genuinely radiant. You will understand. All of you will. It was then that Eleanor Vance began to methodically, elegantly, and irreversibly destroy the lives of everyone who had underestimated her power. Part 4. The Ruthless Truth. Alexander, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the ballroom's silence like glass against glass. Since we are among friends, why don't you tell Scarlett about our conversation last night? Alexander's face paled to a color that rivaled the pearls on his wife's neck. His eyes widened in absolute panic, because there had been no conversation with Eleanor the night before, nor on any night in the last few weeks. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, but his trembling voice betrayed his nervousness. Eleanor tilted her head with feigned curiosity, as if genuinely surprised by her husband's response. No? How odd. Perhaps my memory is failing me. She paused dramatically, scanning the circle of spectators that had formed around them. Or perhaps you forgot to mention to your mentor that we are still married." The word mentor was delivered with such irony that several people in the group had to stifle nervous giggles. Scarlett felt the blood rush to her face, finally realizing she was being publicly ridiculed. "Of course we know you're married," Scarlett said, trying to regain some control over the situation. "But marriages evolve, don't they? Sometimes people find happiness in different places." Eleanor nodded with a graceful tilt of her head. Evolution, a fascinating concept. She turned to Leonore Albright conspiratorially. "Leonore, you, married to Robert for 30 years, have you experienced this evolution?" Leonore laughed, a crystalline sound filled with aristocratic malice. "Never, darling. Robert knows his place very well." The comment was a direct stab at Alexander's masculinity, suggesting he had failed as a man by not maintaining order in his house. Several men present coughed uncomfortably, while their wives exchanged glances of approval. Victoria Albright joined the group, clearly unwilling to miss the spectacle. "Eleanor, it's so good to see you at our events again," she said with feigned effusiveness. "Your presence always raises the level of any occasion." "That's very kind, Victoria. I was just explaining to young Scarlett how certain traditions work in our society." Scarlett felt increasingly cornered. There was something about the way these women spoke, always polite, always elegant, yet carrying a subtle venom that she could not counteract because she did not master the necessary social codes. "Traditions can be outdated," she said, trying to sound sophisticated. "The modern world allows people to be more authentic in their relationships." The silence that followed was so deep, you could hear the clinking of the chandelier crystals swaying gently with the air-conditioning breeze. Eleanor looked at Scarlett for a long moment, like a feline studying its prey before the fatal pounce. "Authenticity," she repeated slowly. "What a powerful word. You are right, dear. Authenticity is key." She paused, her smile turning predatory. "That's why I think it's time we were completely authentic about this situation." Alexander tried desperately to intervene. "Eleanor, perhaps this isn't the place." "Oh, but it is exactly the right place," she interrupted, her voice still maintaining that deadly courtesy. "After all, it was here you chose to make your association public. It's only fair to clarify a few details for our dear friends." Julian Hale had discreetly moved closer, his expression that of a journalist, scenting the story of the century. Other guests also approached, creating an ever-widening circle around the central trio. "You see," Eleanor continued, addressing the audience directly, "Dear Scarlett believes she conquered my husband's heart through her youth and authenticity." She paused for dramatic effect. "What she doesn't know is that Alexander has a very specific pattern when it comes to his extramarital affairs." Scarlett's eyes widened, suddenly realizing she was about to discover something devastating. "A pattern?" Leonore asked, clearly enjoying the moment. "Oh yes, young, ambitious women, from humble backgrounds, easily dazzled by expensive gifts and promises of social ascent." Eleanor listed the characteristics with the precision of a scientist cataloging specimens. "In the last 15 years, there have been at least, let me see, 6 of them." The number fell upon Scarlett like a hammer. She wasn't special. She wasn't unique. She was just the most recent in a long line of temporary replacements. Alexander was visibly desperate. "Eleanor, please!" "Oh, Alexander, don't be modest," she said with false admiration. "You have a special talent for finding these girls, always with the same profile. Receptionists, secretaries, flight attendants, young, impressionable women who mistake male attention for true love." Patricia Albright couldn't contain a giggle. "And what happened to the other 5, darling?" "Well," Eleanor replied, as if recounting a funny anecdote at a tea party, "some were discreetly dismissed when they started making inconvenient demands. Others realized for themselves that they weren't as special as they imagined. 1 or 2 even managed advantageous marriages with more available men." Scarlett felt the world spin around her. Everything she had believed about her relationship with Alexander, her uniqueness, their future plans, her privileged position, was crumbling like a house of cards. But the thing is, Eleanor continued, speaking directly to Scarlett now, you made one mistake none of the others made. What mistake? The question came out as a choked whisper. You thought you had won. The words fell upon Scarlett with the weight of a judicial sentence. She looked around, seeing for the first time the expressions of the guests. Not admiration or envy, as she had imagined, but pity mixed with aristocratic disdain. Alexander never told me about the others, she stammered, turning to him for a denial, an explanation, anything to restore her reality. Alexander couldn't meet her eyes. His guilt was etched onto his face like a tattoo. Of course he didn't tell you, Eleanor said softly. Why would he? It would ruin the fantasy he creates for each of you. The fantasy that you are special, that you are different, that this time it's true love. Leonor Albright shook her head with theatrical disapproval. Men can be so cruel, can't they, leading these poor girls to believe in fairy tales. The cruelty, Eleanor said, is not in having extramarital affairs. Powerful men have always had mistresses. It's almost a tradition. The cruelty lies in creating false expectations, in making these women believe they can occupy a place that was never intended for them. Scarlett finally exploded. And what is that place? That of the submissive wife who accepts everything in silence. The entire ballroom held its breath. It was the first time anyone had directly confronted Eleanor, and everyone wanted to see how she would respond. Eleanor smiled. Not the elegant, controlled smile she had maintained all night, but a genuine, almost amused one. "Oh, my sweet girl," she said, her voice tinged with a blend of pity and condescension. "You really don't understand, do you? Do you think I'm here, as the humiliated wife, trying to win back an unfaithful husband?" She paused. Her eyes scanned all the faces around her. "I didn't come here to fight for Alexander. I came here to give him back to you." The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the sound of the waiter's shoes on the marble could be heard. "Give him back?" Scarlett repeated. Utterly confused. "Yes, darling. You can keep him." Eleanor made an elegant gesture with her hand, as if delivering an undesirable gift. "In fact, I insist you keep him. After all, you both deserve each other." Alexander finally found his voice. "Eleanor, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about freedom, Alexander. Yours and mine." She opened her Hermes bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. "The divorce papers were filed yesterday. You should receive official notification on Monday." The envelope passed from hand to hand, like a grande without a pin. Alexander held it with trembling fingers, his face expressing absolute shock. "But we never even discussed this?" "Yes, we did. For 8 months, Alexander. Every time you came home smelling of another woman's perfume. Every time you lied about where you had been. Every time you treated me like a piece of furniture that decorates the house but doesn't participate in the life happening inside it." Eleanor's voice remained serene, but there was tempered steel in every word. The conversation had been long and unilateral, but it happened. Scarlett looked at Alexander, expecting him to protest, to declare his love, to confirm the future plans they had made together. Instead, he looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. "How much do you want?" was the first thing he managed to say. The question revealed so much about his character that several women present made barely disguised gestures of disgust. "Oh, Alexander," Eleanor said, shaking her head with feigned sadness. "Always reducing everything to money. I don't want your money, darling. I have my own." "Your own?" "Yes. Grandmother Beatrice's inheritance, which you always assumed was insignificant, because it was just women's things like properties and stocks. In reality, it's worth more than your company." She smiled. Much more. The shock on Alexander's face was comical. For 15 years, he had assumed he was the sole provider of the family, the only one with significant resources. Discovering that his wife was not only financially independent, but potentially richer than he was a devastating blow to his male ego. Furthermore, Eleanor continued casually, my art consulting business has grown quite a bit in recent years. International clients, you know, people who value authenticity and experience. Scarlett finally understood the full dimension of her humiliation. She had gambled everything on a man she now discovered wasn't even half the prize she had imagined him to be. So you give us your blessing, she stammered, trying to find some thread of dignity to cling to. Oh, darling, it's not exactly a blessing, Eleanor replied with deadly sweetness. It's more like returning a defective product to the store. The phrase resonated through the ballroom like a gunshot. Several people laughed openly, unable to contain their reaction to the brutal elegance of the retort. Alexander finally exploded. Eleanor, you can't humiliate me like this in public. Humiliate you? She'd appeared genuinely surprised. Alexander, darling, I've done nothing but speak the truth. If the truth is humiliating, perhaps the problem is not mine. Julian Hale approached with his social predator smile. Eleanor, may I have a statement for my column? Of course, Julian. She turned to him with the grace of a seasoned actress. You may say that I am beginning a new chapter in my life. Sometimes, when a door closes, we realize it was actually keeping us captive in a place too small for our dreams. And future plans? I'm moving to Paris next week. I have some interesting projects waiting for me there. The word Paris landed on Alexander as a final sentence. Eleanor wasn't just divorcing him. She was literally fleeing the country, putting an ocean between them. Scarlett, attempting one last desperate move, said, well, at least now Alexander and I can be happy together, without secrets or lies. Eleanor looked at her with a mix of pity and amusement. Oh, my sweet, naive girl, she said, her voice filled with an almost maternal condescension. Do you really believe a man who cheated on his wife with you won't cheat on you with another? The truth of the statement hit Scarlett like a punch to the gut. She looked at Alexander, searching for some sign of denial, some guarantee of future fidelity. Instead, he seemed to shrink further, clearly unwilling to publicly commit to her after the night's disaster. The lack of support was the final straw. Scarlett realized she had lost not only the battle against Eleanor, but also any chance of a future with Alexander. He was too cowardly to defend her when she needed him, too weak to take responsibility for his own actions. It was in that moment of absolute silence that Eleanor Vance delivered the final blow. Well, Eleanor said, adjusting the pearls at her neck with an elegant final gesture. It was a pleasure clarifying all of this. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some dear friends to bid farewell to before my trip. She turned to leave, but stopped as if recalling something important. Oh, and Scarlett? The young woman looked up with hope, perhaps believing Eleanor would offer some word of reconciliation or advice. The red dress looks beautiful on you, but for charity events, more subdued colors are more appropriate. It's a matter of social etiquette. The final critique was delivered with such elegance that even the most seasoned observers needed a few seconds to fully process the brutality of the comment. Eleanor had just given an etiquette lesson in the middle of a public humiliation, definitively establishing the social hierarchy between them. Scarlett stood still, paralyzed by shame, as Eleanor walked away with grace. Alexander remained by her side, but it was obvious to all that he was in shock, still processing the speed with which his life had collapsed. Julian Hale watched the scene with the keen eye of someone who had just witnessed the social story of the year. He was already mentally drafting the headline, The Elegant Revenge, How Eleanor Vance Turned Humiliation into Triumph at the Season's Most Talked About Ball. Part 5. The Unsurpassable Legacy. 3 years later, the The apartment in the 16th arrondissement overlooked the Eiffel Tower and was decorated with a perfect blend of French elegance and sophistication. Eleanor Vance, now Eleanor Dubois, sat on the terrace, sipping coffee while watching her 2-year-old twins, Henry and Beatrice, play in the private garden. Pierre Dubois walked onto the terrace carrying a tray with fresh croissants and the morning paper. "Mon amour," he said, kissing Eleanor's forehead gently. "There is an interesting article here about America." Eleanor smiled, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. At 38, she radiated a happiness she had never experienced during her 15 years of marriage to Alexander. Pierre was not just a better husband, he was a true partner, someone who respected her intelligence and ambition as much as he admired her beauty. What kind of article? About corporate bankruptcies? It seems a real estate developer called Sterling Ventures closed its doors last month. Alexander? Apparently. The article mentions financial mismanagement and lawsuits. The owner, Alexander Sterling, is under investigation for tax irregularities. Eleanor felt no pleasure in the news. That phase of her life was completely over. But there was a certain poetic justice in the fact that Alexander, who had always considered himself financially superior to her, had lost everything due to his own incompetence. "And the young woman he was with that night at the Grand Astor Club?" asked Pierre, who knew the whole story. "Scarlett." Eleanor mused for a moment. "I heard she married a dentist in Miami. Apparently she learned the lesson of not betting on losing horses." Pierre laughed, a rich, warm sound that resonated on the terrace. "You are terrible, darling, but it is poetic justice, as we say." Henry ran toward the table, speaking an adorable mixture of English and French. "Mama, look, I picked a flower for you." Eleanor lifted her son, accepting the small daisy he had gathered in the garden. Beatrice soon joined them, demanding equal attention. "Mes petits trésors," Pierre murmured, watching the scene with obvious adoration. This was the life Eleanor had built for herself, not as revenge against Alexander, but as a reward for her own courage. She had transformed betrayal into liberation, humiliation into opportunity, and an ending into a new beginning. Dubois' gallery had become one of the most prestigious in Paris under her curatorship, and she was expecting her third child, a girl they would name Sophie, after the grandmother who had left her the inheritance that made her independence possible. As she watched her children play in the Parisian garden, Eleanor reflected on the night at the Grand Astor Club 3 years ago. She had planned every detail of that public humiliation, but now she realized that the true victory had not been destroying Alexander and Scarlett that night. The true victory was this: a life built on her own terms, with a man who loved her completely, children who filled her heart, and a career that satisfied her soul. In the end, Eleanor Vance had discovered that the best revenge is not the destruction of your enemies, but the construction of a life so spectacular that it makes everything they did to try to diminish you utterly irrelevant. Final reflection and call to action. Closing. The story of Eleanor Vance teaches us that regret only has value when it turns into action. Her story is not about winning a battle, but about conquering a personal empire. Final, meaningful question. Was Eleanor's most powerful moment the public humiliation of Scarlett and Alexander at the club? Or was it her life 3 years later, where she no longer felt pleasure in their collapse? Leave your comment below. If this story inspires you to take control of your own life, like and share. And of course, subscribe for more stories of queens who stage a comeback.